Aaron Gilmore.
The question be now put.
I'll hear from Claire Curran.
Chair. Mr Chair, I'd like to say that thank you to the Minister for taking a call. I'm very pleased that you got to your feet and actually talked to us about some of the issues that have been raised, and in particular that you talked about the importance of equivalence of inputs as a concept. It's just a pity that isn't actually reflected in the bill that we have before us tonight as being reflected as a real open access regime. I'd like to address the amendment which the Labour Party have put up, replacing clause 24 with a new section 156AD clause 3 to insert a new paragraph which basically addresses the issue of the indemnity of Telecom in the contract and essentially prevents and puts restrictions in the way of the Crown indemnifying Telecom and putting the risk onto itself on this issue. And I want to give some very good reasons for this, which some of my colleagues have touched on today, but which go to the heart again of this bill, which is around true competition and putting the long-term benefits of end users at the heart of it. This is the biggest telecommunications change that's happened in this country for a long time, perhaps ever. It involves, as my colleague Stuart Nash said, the split up of the state monopoly. Now that split is yet to be determined how it's going to occur. The said company, Telecom, is very silent at the moment, can't speak because of its of the separation which is underway. But I'd just like to address that briefly, Mr Chair, in relation to the clause, the amendment that I'm putting up today, which is around the Crown taking the risk. Because when you look at how that split takes place, we don't yet know how a 3-box model is going to turn into a 2-box model, and which bits are going to end up in the new Chorus 2, and what the impact on the Crown of that is going to be if Telecom, if the pricing situation doesn't work, if the Commerce Commission decides that the pricing isn't right and that it needs to intervene, if the Minister of the day is forced into a situation of agreeing with that, but then the Crown takes the risk, which this Minister has freely said in this House and at the Select Committee there has been no analysis done of what that risk might be, and there's been no ability for the public to have scrutiny of it. I just want to read you some figures from the year ended 30 of June 2010 from Telecom's annual report, which talks about Chorus's EBITDA, which was $754 million. So that's Chorus, that's the infrastructure level. Then there's wholesale and international, which is $226 million, and telecom retail, which is $396 million. So if you end up with a good swag of the wholesale and international going into
Order.
Chorus, Mr Chair.
The points that you're making are out of scope. You must come back to part 2.
Mr Chair, this goes to part 2 and the amendment which Labor is putting up around the indemnity to the Crown and just what that indemnity is going to involve, because if you end up with a separated Telecom, which is almost at least 2/3, which it looks it's going to be, of Telecom, then that separated company does not have sufficient scrutiny by the independent regulator. First of all, how that separation is going to occur, and secondly, how the open access regime is going to operate in that environment, which is why when we look at clause 24 and the amendment which Labor is putting up the risk to the Crown is even greater, and why the indemnity to Telecom in this area. Telecom, a company which has a track record of price gouging and anti-competitive behaviour, and I've gone to the trouble of going and finding out and listing some of those breaches, Mr. Chair.
Chair Curran.
Mr. Chair, which I think are relevant and important to this debate, because the public of New Zealand need to know that the new monopoly that's being created, which the Crown is going to give indemnity to in case of future price issues, and at which there might need to be regulation, and any cost of those price changes are going to be borne by the Crown in some form or another, which is yet to be determined, because there's been no public scrutiny of that, because it was introduced at a very late stage after this bill was brought back to the House. And so that's why I think that this House needs to know what it's up for, and what this new monopoly is going to look like, and just how much of a free ride it's going to get under this legislation, and why investor certainty is being put up as being somehow the most important thing that we must be considering when we're talking about, first of all, the actual ultra-fast broadband scheme, and also this bill before the House, before the interests of consumers, before the interests of taxpayers. Because let's remember that there's $1.5 billion tied up in this scheme overall, and it's taxpayers' money. It's taxpayers' money, and the taxpayers of New Zealand need to feel that it's accountable. And we know that it's being looked at. It's being looked at quite hard from outside. That there is serious concerns around the impact of the anti-competitiveness of it, and as we've seen just in the last week, there's been more admissions around errors with Telecom and around how people are being charged. And I would like to put on the record that it's not unusual in the telecommunications sector anywhere in the world for there to be errors, and for there to be blunders, and for there to be breaches, and for those breaches to be taken into a civil court, and for fines to be made. But when you look at the history in this country of the monopoly incumbent, in how it's breached the system, how it's been found guilty, and the sheer number of them. And I just want to mention a couple of them, because there have been some very significant cases in recent years. I've got a list of them where they've been fined for failure to disclose costs, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, this goes to the heart of point 2 and the amendment that Labor is putting up around the need for the indemnity of Telecom to be rescinded, and for there to be a requirement for the Crown not to indemnify Telecom in this legislation, because investor certainty is not the only consideration. Consumer confidence and fairness and competition are other values that also need to be taken into consideration. And I see the Minister shaking his head, and I'd be very happy if he wants to leap to his feet and share with the House why it is that somehow Telecom needs to be indemnified, and how he came to the decision that was going to happen. Because as I understand it, there's also a clause, and he might like to enlighten me and the House on this, that there's also a clause being inserted into the Rural Broadband Initiative that indemnifies Telecom and Vodafone against their non-ability in case that they aren't able to perform the requirements, and that they won't incur costs. That would actually be a useful thing as well, because the indemnity of the companies involved in the broadband environment is not the paramount issue, and somehow it's ended up where that's the case. I do want to mention a couple of these breaches, because they do go to the heart of why we need to put up this amendment at clause 24. to ensure that the Crown alone does not bear the costs of the ability of Telecom to be able to change its pricing structure if the Commerce Commission decides to intervene in the future between now and the end of 2019. In 2003, Telecom pleaded guilty to fair trading breaches.
Mr. Chair.
Michael Woodhouse.
I move that the question